I am very pleased to invite you to watch our second episode in the historical series titled The King Who Created a Republic. In 1562, Sigismund Augustus, King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, confronted two serious problems. His third marriage had failed without producing a male heir, and a Russian tyrant had invaded his country, bent on seizing the Ruthenian territories, including Belarus and Ukraine. These would appear to be problems of differing significance. However, the defense of the Ruthenian lands depended on the united force of Poland and Lithuania, and the ongoing union of those two countries dependent on the birth of a male heir. Sigismund Augustus was nothing like England's Henry VIII. When the Pope refused the Polish king a divorce from his third wife, the king seemed to shrug. His contemporaries and later some historians criticized him for his passivity. In fact, Sigismund Augustus channeled all his energy for the next 7 years into forging a union based not on producing male heirs, but on electing the right leader and representatives. He guided his people into creating the Republic of Both Nations, which proved powerful enough to hold off the Russian menace for another century. Jeff Prince spent years studying the last generation of the Jagiellonian dynasty for a novel he was writing about Sigismund Augustus and Barbara Radziwiłł. He was fascinated by the paradoxical nature of this king, who was both the personification of the patriarchal system and a rebel against traditional authority. At 27, Sigismund Augustus defied family, church, and state by secretly marrying Barbara and then forcing them to accept her as queen. 20 years later, he renounced his dynasty hereditary rights and created a republic. This is a story Jeff thought worth telling an American audience. This presentation was taped during the third week of Putin's invasion on Ukraine, which certainly adds poignancy to the story it tells.
Once upon a time, there were two countries that bordered on each other. The time we want to talk about is July 1st, 1569, when a joint parliament in Lublin voted into law a lasting union of these two countries, and their king, a man named Sigismund Augustus, mounted his horse and rode through a downpour to the church. There he ordered the singing of a Te Deum with its hymn of thanksgiving, and sang it himself in a ringing voice with tears streaming down his face. To grasp the powerful emotion this king felt that day, we have to talk about things that happened more than 200 years earlier. So, in 1386, there were two countries that bordered on each other. One was the Kingdom of Poland, Slavic people. Their religion was Roman Catholic, with allegiance to the Pope in Rome. The language of political discourse and their law code was Latin. In general, their culture and political organization had evolved in step with countries in Western Europe. The second, larger country was the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Baltic people famous for their beautiful forests and warlike horsemen. It was the last pagan land in Europe, and its political structure was evolving from tribal traditions. The language of political discourse and their law code was Ruthenian. That was because the Lithuanian Grand Duke ruled vast Ruthenian territories that stretched from the southern border of Lithuania almost to the Black Sea. The people in these territories were Slavic. They belonged to the Eastern Orthodox Church with its patriarch in Constantinople, and their culture was informed by the Eastern Roman Empire. That culture had thrived, especially around Kiev, until 1240. First, invasion by the Mongolian horde all but wiped it out, near total devastation. Then the Lithuanians, welcomed for the most part by the Ruthenian princes, freed the land from the vestiges of Mongolian rule and presided over its slow regeneration. By 1386, the Grand Duke of Lithuania held lands including today's Belarus and Ukraine, stretching 1,100 miles from the Baltic Sea almost to the Black Sea. Now about that time, remember, 1386, the Piast dynasty that had ruled Poland died out, and the nobility of Poland elected Jadwiga, granddaughter of the sister of the last Piast king, and crowned her Rex, or king. Despite her official title, they felt she needed a husband to lead the army and share administrative duties, so they arranged her marriage to Jagiello, Grand Duke of Lithuania. After he was baptized into the Roman Catholic Church and pledged to baptize the Lithuanian people, he too was crowned king. The Grand Duke of Lithuania became the King of Poland, and a union was born and ratified by treaty. Jadwiga died at 26 after giving birth to her only child, who also died. Jagiello married 3 more times, but it was not until he was 73 that his 4th wife gave birth to his first son and then a second son. That first son died in battle at 20. Thus the union of the two countries, which was basically a successful military alliance, was maintained through the second son and his heirs. In Lithuania, the dynasty had hereditary rights. A son of the last Grand Duke inherited the dukedom, or if a son was lacking, a brother of the last Grand Duke. The Poles, who claimed to elect their kings, in each instance except one, elected the man who inherited the dukedom in order to preserve the union with Lithuania. That union endured as long as the same person was king and Grand Duke. Historians call this kind of arrangement a personal union. Now we can come back to Sigismund Augustus, riding through the pouring rain to the church where he sang his lungs out for joy. He was the 7th King Grand Duke in the Jagiellonian line, born in 1520 to King Sigismund I and his Italian-born wife Bona Sforza. A few years later, when a cousin died in battle, he became the only male heir in the line of males stretching back to Jagiello. In 1527, Queen Bona, in the 7th month of her last pregnancy, went hunting. A bear was released from its cage. It was supposed to run off into the woods with hunters in pursuit. Instead, it charged directly at the queen. Her terrified horse reared and she fell to the ground. The bear swerved away at the last moment, but as a result of her fall, Bona gave birth prematurely to her only other male child, who was baptized and died. That swerving bear changed the history of Europe. Sigismund Augustus, or Augustus as he was known, was an heir without a spare. His life's course was set. He would inherit, he would be elected, he would reign, he would embody the union of his two realms. Of necessity, he would marry a princess of the blood and father a son in order to preserve his dynasty and the union. There were moments in his life when he clearly resented, even rebelled against the fate imposed on him by accidents of birth and death. Augustus was raised to be the perfect Renaissance ruler. His controlling mother brought tutors and masters from Renaissance Italy to instruct and train him. Dancing, singing, dueling, jousting, he had to be the best, and he was. He was immersed in the classical writers who inspired Renaissance thinkers and doers. He could quote whole pages of Virgil and whole orations by Cicero. He spoke Polish, Latin, Italian, and German. He was a brilliant communicator. Whether engaging in patient persuasion, strategic evasion, or dramatic pronouncements, he was regarded as the most effective speaker of the age. A brilliant, well-informed ruler. But there was a darker aspect to his character, All contemporary reports suggest he suffered from melancholia, excess of black bile, which today we call chronic depression. He seemed to be particularly disturbed by what 21st century psychologists are calling disgust with a capital D, that is, supersensitivity, repulsion to biological processes, illness, aging, putrefaction, and behind all that, death. He avoided the sick or maimed. He preferred to dine alone, and often to be alone. His own family seemed to repel him, and after 1524 he avoided cohabiting with them even for short spells. All that was to complicate his fulfilling of his first obligation, to produce an heir. His first marriage was arranged by his father years in advance. It was a prestigious match with Elizabeth of Austria, daughter of Ferdinand Habsburg, Archduke of Austria, King of Hungary and Bohemia, next Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. The dowry was 100,000 ducats. Elizabeth was 16, pretty but fragile, when she arrived in Krakow on May 6, 1543. On that day, she met Augustus for the first time and proceeded to the cathedral for the wedding and crowning. During the second ceremony, the old king noticed her head wobbling under the weight of her crown. He rose and placed it on her lap. He was to remain her protector throughout her brief marriage. The wedding night was a fiasco. She panicked. And then relations got worse. It was discovered she suffered from epilepsy, a disease frightening to those who do not understand it, with terrible seizures that are distressing to witness. Augustus, who had his hang-ups, was repelled. He found the situation at court close to unbearable. His father was urging him to impregnate his wife. His mother was urging him to repudiate her. The bride who had been thrust upon him was lying sick, frightened, simply not up to the role that had been thrust upon her. And behind this complicated domestic scene, there was an even more threatening political situation. His 70-year-old father was failing, and his 49-year-old mother was picking up the reins of power the old king dropped. She was keeping them from falling into Augustus's hands. It was becoming apparent to him that his mother would become a major obstacle to his taking his rightful position when his father died. Within 2 months of the wedding, Augustus and his household fled into Lithuania and settled at a hunting lodge not far from the capital, Vilnius. It looked as if he preferred hunting boar to fulfilling his obligations. In fact, Bona had been managing Lithuania for her husband and had made many enemies. Augustus went there seeking allies, and the Radziwiłł cousins immediately connected with him. Black Nicholas, who would become his right-hand man, and Red Nicholas, known as Rudy, who would become a military leader. Their fathers and uncles had once controlled Lithuania, but Bona suppressed the family, and the younger generation held no offices and had no authority at all. They thought they could fix all that by supporting the next Grand Duke and King. Augustus stayed away for a year. Then the old king and Bona, bringing Elizabeth with them, came to Lithuania for a meeting with the Council of Lords. Augustus joined them, and with the support of his new allies proposed that he be made Grand Duke of Lithuania under the aegis of his father. The argument that convinced the old king is quoted in the Chronicle. Augustus told his father, "I am 23 years old and I have no home to bring my wife to. In other words, give me the job and the real estate that goes with it, and I'll take up my life with Elizabeth in the hope of producing an heir." Over Bona's loud objections, she actually threw herself on the bed and pretended to have a heart attack. The king and council approved the proposal. Augustus and Elizabeth entered Vilnius and took up life in the Grand Ducal Palace. He treated her with courtesy and showered her with gifts. He even imported sour oranges for her when she couldn't tolerate the sweet ones. But there was little evidence that he did much of anything about getting an heir. Still, it looked good. His father and her father were pleased. Then in June of 1545, after 5 successive days of seizures, Elizabeth died. Augustus was in Krakow at the time, picking up the 100,000 ducat dowry that had finally been paid. Augustus's first marriage failed of its purpose. His second marriage was a love match. You see, Rudy Radziwiłł had a sister who was considered the most beautiful woman in both realms. Barbara Radziwiłł was a widow. She had been married off at 14, an arranged marriage which lasted 5 years but produced no offspring. According to the thinking of the time, that was Barbara's fault. She was a barren woman. She was also a beautiful, wealthy young widow with a measure of independence that goes with widowhood, celebrated for her charm and style, living with her mother, as chance would have it, in the palace next to the Grand Ducal Palace. Whether Black Nicholas intended her to seduce Augustus has been debated. The question is probably irrelevant. Barbara and Augustus met, and quite independent of anyone's political schemes, fell in love. When Elizabeth died, Barbara was recognized as the young Grand Duke's mistress. Bona was not pleased. Her rebellious son was administering the Grand Duchy she used to manage. With the help of his mistress, he was turning the court in Vilnius into a cultural center that rivaled Krakow. Worse still, he was literally in bed with her old enemies. She decided to intervene. She began to arrange a marriage for her son with Anna Sophia, daughter of the Duke of Prussia and granddaughter of the Danish king. To avoid yet another arranged marriage and to preserve the bond that had grown up between him and Barbara, Augustus secretly married Barbara close to his 27th birthday in August 1547. The marriage was an act of rebellion on both their parts. To marry for love was considered selfishness. It was to prefer individual desire over the well-being of the family and, in this case, the state. But it was worse than that. Augustus had willfully married a woman who was his mistress and therefore believed to be unchaste. He had willfully married a woman who was believed to be barren and therefore incapable of producing an heir. He had married a woman who was not royal, but the daughter of one of the many magnate families vying for the next king's favor. As Bona told the story, a debauched widow, Barbara, deployed by an ambitious political faction, Black Nicholas, had seduced the sex-obsessed and foolish heir to the throne, Augustus, and duped him into marriage. Based on her version of events, orations, sermons, treatises, rhyming satires, and smutty broadsheets were written, read aloud, and published. Remember, the printing press had been invented only 100 years earlier, and the printing press made the smear campaign a major political weapon during the Renaissance. By the time the old king died in 1548, the whole nation had been turned against the heir apparent. Augustus, who had returned to Krakow to claim his throne, fought back. At a 4-week meeting of his first Sejm, his first parliament, he defied the unanimous demand of the delegates that he repudiate his wife. Then he re-entered Krakow with Barbara at his side and began to govern. Through deft political moves and political appointments that often involve grants of land from the royal domain, he established his authority, while Barbara struggled to overcome the hostility of a court that still believed Bona's distorted version of events. After 2 years of maneuvering, Augustus convinced the Archbishop of Gniezno to crown Barbara in the cathedral. She made a brave showing that day, and copies of the publicity painting of her in her pearl headdress and crown have become a historic icon. But she was already ill. Only 5 months later she died, perhaps of ovarian cancer, more likely of sepsis. At Barbara's request, Augustus led her funeral cortege for 28 days back to Vilnius, where he interred her body. Then he remained in Lithuania, the realm he had come to regard as his home, returning to Poland only for meetings of the Sejm and other important events. A second marriage had ended. Still no heir. By 1553, the 5th year of his reign, Augustus could no longer resist the pressure to marry again. Black Nicholas held the highest offices in the Grand Duchy and was now his closest advisor. Augustus sent him to Ferrara in Italy and Bavaria in Germany, looking for an appropriate match. He never got further than the court of King Ferdinand, Augustus's first father-in-law. Nicholas wanted to focus Ferdinand's attention on Lithuania and away from its enemies. Ferdinand wanted to build a Habsburg coterie in the center of the Jagiellonian court. They agreed that Augustus should marry Catherine, the youngest sister of his first wife Elizabeth. Augustus resisted this idea. Nicholas sent him enthusiastic letters pointing out the political advantages, and Augustus finally consented. This time he had played it by the book, but still things went wrong. Catherine was by no means as attractive as her sister Elizabeth, and she was a lot more ambitious. She connected with Bona and started to plot against Black Nicholas, to whom she owed so much. She created the Habsburg coterie that her father wanted. The pro-Habsburg nobles gathered in her chambers, and she coached the emissaries and spies that came from Austria to meet with or observe her husband. Augustus was not pleased. He let her know he did not approve. When he returned from an 8-week meeting of the Sejm in Poland, she tried to win back his favor by announcing she was pregnant. In a few months, when it became apparent she wasn't. After that, they appeared together, but they weren't together. In 1559 and 60, she was ill. She insisted that only Austrian physicians treat her. Thus the nature of her illness remained a secret. Augustus concluded she had epilepsy like her sister, and after that there was no chance of intimacy between them. They met for the last time in 1562 at the wedding of Augustus's youngest sister to the future King of Sweden. For the next 10 years, Catherine was housed in castles far from the center of political activity and the person of the king. The third marriage lasted 19 years, usually apart the first 9, always apart the last 10. There was still no heir. Under pressure from his courtiers, Augustus tried once during those 10 years of separation to obtain a divorce. But Catherine's Habsburg relatives intervened and the Pope said no. After that, Augustus did nothing to end or revive the marriage. His passivity was criticized by his contemporaries and by historians. They blamed it on his melancholic disposition, his periods of listlessness, his penchant for delay, his ambivalence about so many issues. Given the chaos that loomed ahead, if the Jagiellonian line failed, passivity would have been reprehensible. In fact, Augustus was never more active in mind and body than he was during those 10 years. He set out a long-term strategy to avoid the chaos that might follow his death and pursued it until he realized his goal. He set out to create a real union, a republic of both nations that would render the end of the Jagiellonian line and the business of producing male heirs totally irrelevant. Remember, it was in October of 1562 that Augustus saw his third wife for the last time. 1 month later, at a meeting of the Polish Sejm in Piotrków, he took the first strategic step in what would be a 7-year campaign to create a closer, lasting union. While that Sejm was in session, an event occurred that supercharged his determination to bind his two realms together. A large army penetrated deep into Lithuania and besieged the prosperous city of Polotsk. Leading that army was Ivan IV of Muscovy, a growing state that would later be called Russia. He is also known in history as Ivan the Terrible, terrible in the sense of inspiring terror. He was a tyrant who felt free, for instance, to murder scores of his boyars, his nobles, whom he suspected of plotting against him, or of massacring 12,000 inhabitants of a city rumored to be disloyal. Ivan's grandmother had been the niece of the last emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire. When Ivan was crowned, he took the title Tsar, derived from Caesar. His full title was Tsar of all the Russias, and that included all the Ruthenian lands that had been part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania for more than 2 centuries. His army carried with it a silver coffin that he was intended for Augustus's corpse. In fact, it was the Grand Duchy itself he intended to smash so he could take the Ruthenian lands. In 1562, Ivan made clear he meant it. He was already at war with Augustus over Livonia, a territory that included today's Latvia and Estonia. Late in the year, instead of marching his army into Livonia, he invaded Lithuania and besieged Polotsk. The walls were made of wood. He brought 200 cannons. The garrison consisted of 400 Poles and 2,000 Lithuanians. Ivan's army was at least 40,000 strong. The governor was supposed to hold out until the Lithuanian army arrived. In 10 days, the city was in flames and the governor surrendered. That was February 15th. Rudy Radzivill's army wasn't ready to march until August. Augustus received the news while he was presiding over the Sejm in Piotrków. It was obvious to all that he was shattered. It was said he mourned the loss of Polotsk more deeply than the death of Barbara. He had begun to realize that if he did not find a way to bind his 2 realms together permanently, Lithuania, the realm closest to his heart, would not survive. The Sejm Augustus had gathered in Piotrków consisted of 2 chambers. The dignitaries seated in the square surrounding the king made up the Senate. They are members of the magnate families that own huge estates and, like their ancestors, have been appointed to the highest offices: chancellor, treasurer, grand marshal, bishop, archbishop, the governors of various provinces. The men standing behind the king make up the Chamber of Deputies. They were elected in the Sejmiks, local Sejms, in each district in each province. They represented the mass of land-owning families, sometimes known as the ordinary nobility or the gentry. The 2 chambers met separately until the king called them together, at which time the deputies would stand behind the row of senators facing the king, and their spokesman would address him from within the square, presenting petitions and making demands. The deputies representing the gentry had their own political platform, usually called the execution of the laws. One plank that particularly interested Augustus called for the execution of old treaties dating back to 1385 that bound Poland and Lithuania together in one political body. Another plank, the one that came first for the deputies, concerned the transfer of lands from the royal domain to the magnates. In a variety of transactions, income-producing land held by the king passed permanently into the hands of the magnates. Laws were on the books forbidding or regulating such transactions. Augustus, like his father, consistently evaded or stalled any debate in the Sejm that would interfere in his management of the royal lands or recover lands illegally held by the magnates. But in November of 1562, Augustus did a political about-face. He set aside the Italianate clothing he usually wore and donned the contush and zupan universally worn by the gentry and opened the Sejm. And when the spokesman for the deputies entered the square and demanded the execution of the laws, the king agreed. The rest of the session was given over to passing statutes that revived old ignored laws and to beginning the audit that would return lands illegally held. Augustus had embraced the political program of the deputies. He had in effect thrown in his lot with the gentry. Why? because he had come to realize that by cooperation with the deputies representing the mass of the gentry, he could get what he needed: tax money to pay for the war in Livonia and support for a closer, binding union. 1 year later, Augustus summoned a joint meeting of the Seims of Poland and Lithuania in Warsaw to discuss the future of the Union. Lithuania sent a delegation chosen by Black Nicholas, who alone spoke for everyone. At first he spoke freely and eloquently. He clearly defined the different positions of the two sides. The Lithuanians wanted to preserve the identity and dignity of their nation within a defensive union. The Poles, as he put it, wanted to be joined as provinces and grow together as one. Obviously, some compromise had to be reached if there were to be a consensus. And in fact, the first joint Sejm in Warsaw came close to doing so. Then, an exhausted courier on a lathered horse rode in with important news. A Lithuanian army led by Rudy Radziwiłł had trounced the Muscovite forces on the Ula River. Although Polotsk had not been retaken, the mood of the Lithuanians was transformed. Citing unresolved differences, Black Nicholas and his hand-picked delegation withdrew. During the next 6 years, Augustus called and presided over countless Sejm meetings in each country and joint meetings held in the cities between the two countries. Patiently he listened while each side had its say. The Lithuanians now argued for a military alliance embodied by an elected king. The Polish deputies insisted that old treaties had already bound the two countries together as one body. All that was needed was a reorganization that reflected that fact. Augustus met with and coaxed key figures in groups, and at the end of each session he adjudicated the arguments. He tried continually to emerge with a position that could be argued further at the next Sejm. But he also used those 6 years to push through the reforms that would permit a real union when the two sides finally came together. A real union required uniting the major political institutions of the two countries. To do so, there had to be parity between those institutions. Augustus's first move, and in some ways the most shocking, concerned the monarch. During the first joint session in Warsaw, he issued a decree in effect renouncing the Jagiellonian dynasty's hereditary rights. Remember, the Lithuanian Grand Dukes had hereditary rights, father to a son, or if none, to a brother. The Poles who elected their kings were forced to elect the son or brother in order to preserve the union. Augustus ended all that by his decree. His decree would permit the united electors of the new union to choose an executive for merit, not for blood. In the late 16th century, when the divine right of kings was ascendant in all but a few European countries, that was an extraordinary idea to suggest, let alone decree. Creating parity between the Sejms of the two countries was a bigger job. Remember, the Polish Sejm was made up of a Senate and a Chamber of Deputies. Lithuania was governed in the Grand Duke's absence by a Council of Lords dominated by the Radziwiłłs. The Council of Lords was comparable to the Polish Senate, but there was no Chamber of Deputies. Representatives of the gentry were assembled from time to time to receive instructions, but there was no structured assembly in which the gentry could regularly convey its views. First, Augustus carved more provinces out of the Grand Duchy so that the governors of these provinces could dilute the power of the Radziwiłłs in the Council of Lords. Then he instructed the districts in all of the provinces to elect sejmiks, local Sejms, that would elect deputies to meet in the Lithuanian Chamber of Deputies. This was a difficult, in some way extraordinary process. The monarch was teaching the nobility to stand up and insist on its rights. Augustus had begun his campaign for a binding union by affiliating himself with the Polish gentry. He then worked steadily to organize and enfranchise the gentry of Lithuania. The union, as he imagined it, would have an elected king and an elected chamber of deputies. Augustus was creating an electorate. He was also elevating the gentry, represented by the deputies, to become a third estate equal to the King Grand Duke and the magnates represented by the senators. In doing so, of course, he was intensifying the opposition. With each reform he introduced, the magnate families stood to lose dominion in Lithuania. Black Nicholas was the leader of that opposition. Another European king would have eliminated him. Augustus sent him persuasive letters expounding his political vision. But then fate stepped in. Black Nicholas died of natural causes in 1565, and Rudy, who was by no means as formidable an opponent, took up the leadership. In 1569, Augustus summoned a joint parliament in Lublin to finish the job. Again, the Lithuanian delegation was led and controlled by Rudy and several other magnates. The debate went on, mostly in separate sessions through January and into February. Augustus met privately with the Lithuanians, trying to coax them into compromise. Finally, he called for a joint session and direct negotiations on February 26. The rumor went round that he would indicate which of the old treaties would serve as a model for the new union. During the night, the Lithuanians secretly fled from Lublin, leaving only 2 representatives to report on subsequent events. The Lithuanians had the right to withdraw, but they virtually snuck out of town without a word of explanation or a farewell to the king. The response of the Polish deputies was probably conceived in anger and intended as punishment, but once Augustus seized upon the proposals and issued the decrees, they became one of the most brilliant and courageous parliamentary moves in history. The Polish deputies pointed out that if there were to be no union, the border disputes between the two countries would have to be resolved. Poland had claims on the Lithuanian province of Podlaskie, which lay between the two countries, and on Volhynia, a Ruthenian territory held by Lithuanians for more than 200 years. In March, Augustus issued a decree ceding Podlaskie to Poland, another ceding Volhynia and the adjacent Wrocław to Poland, and a third demanding that any noble who held land in these provinces come to Lublin and swear fealty to the Polish king. It was a gamble. Some of the nobles summoned were actually Lithuanians. Others were Ruthenians and had thrived under the lenient rule of the Grand Duchy. Still, they were being asked to swear allegiance to the same man they had served for 21 years under another title. Furthermore, it was generally recognized that the nobles who served the King of Poland had more liberties and rights than those who served the Grand Duke. Finally, in May, major figures from Volhynia arrived in Lublin, and the rest followed. But the Lithuanian Sejm had still not returned to the talks. So Augustus issued a 4th decree. At the urging of the Volhynian lords and the Poles, he took the huge Ruthenian province surrounding Kiev, most of what today is Ukraine, from Lithuania and gave it to Poland. The Polish legal claim to this area was negligible, but taking it seemed at the time a brilliant strategical move for 2 reasons. The Ruthenian lands ceded to Poland bordered on Muscovy and were the heart of the lands Ivan coveted. The Poles were now bound to fight Muscovy to preserve their own territory. Second, this last annexation made it clear that a union was forming that would exclude only Lithuania. After further promises and delays, the Lithuanian Sejm returned to Lublin on June 6. Rudy Radziwiłł was no longer the leader. In fact, he never returned at all. And so the debate resumed, and within 3 weeks the two sides had reached a compromise. A compromise very similar to the plan almost realized 7 years earlier in Warsaw. There would be one monarch elected by the two nations meeting in one place at one time. There would be one bicameral Sejm for all issues, made up of senators from both nations and deputies elected in each nation. These provisions satisfied the Poles' demand for a real union of governing institutions. But there was more. Each nation would have its own officers. Each nation would retain its own legal statutes. So under one King Grand Duke, there would be a chancellor, a treasurer, a grand marshal, etc. for each nation. Each nation would retain its own code of laws. The Lithuanians lost some of the ceremonial issues. The seal would be the Polish seal, and the coronation would take place in Krakow. But its name, the title of its ruler, the administrative and military officials, and its laws had all been preserved. The structure of a united government, an elected monarch, and a bicameral legislature made up of officials appointed by the elected monarch and delegates elected locally was anticipated by the structure the gentry had been trying to realize in Poland. It also resembled the political structure of the serene Republic of Venice, with its Doge elected for life, its Council of Ten, and its Grand Council. The university, favored by Polish nobles studying law, medicine, or humanities, was in Padua, 25 miles outside of Venice. But there is no doubt that Augustus found his model in Cicero's mixed government, which mixed the virtues and eliminated the vices of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. That is what the Union of Lublin ordained: an elected monarch whose power is limited by contracts signed at election, a senate made up of the elite appointed by the monarch, and a chamber of deputies made up of delegates elected locally from, as it turned out, the same mass of people that elected the king. That the mass of people which represented the deputies and which elected the king was limited to the landowning class was typical of the time. It wasn't until the 19th century that a stable European republic or constitutional monarchy expanded the franchise beyond property owners, and until the 20th century that they reached universal suffrage. The name of the new union was Rzeczpospolita Obojga Narodów, which is frequently translated as the Commonwealth of Both Nations. But Rzeczpospolita is more often translated as Republic. And in fact, the real union created in Lublin was a republic in the term, as the term was understood at the time. The rule of one, the rule of the few, and the rule of the many, each limited in its function, limited by law, limited by balance with the others, debating until they reach consensus. The joy of Sigismund Augustus on July 1st, 1569, as he rode through the rain to the church, was certainly justified. He had steered his contemporaries into creating a union that could withstand the aggression of Russia. The Commonwealth of both nations was able to protect the Ruthenian lands during its first 100 years. Although it lost part of Ukraine in 1668, it held on to the rest for a total of 224 years, until, by agreement of the three greatest military powers in Europe, they became part of the Russian Empire. During the 20th century, the political structure ordained in Lublin has frequently been panned by historians, political theorists, and publicists. Absolutists, nationalists, fascists, Marxists, who in succession tried to dominate the intellectual life in Central and Eastern Europe, all had their reasons to disparage the Union. An unbiased historian, looking first at its inception, its early years, before focusing on its failure 224 years later, might come to a more positive assessment. Considered in its own historical context, which is the Renaissance, the creation of the Commonwealth of both nations and its first century of operation are nothing to be despised.